Now that you know some of the fundamentals of CSS Grid in practice, let's now also learn some theory about it. And so just like with Flexbox, the first question that we ask is what actually is CSS Grid? And at the most basic level, CSS Grid is a set of CSS properties that web developers can use to build two-dimensional layouts. And when CSS Grid was first developed and brought into browsers a couple of years ago, the main idea behind it was that now we could divide a container element into rows and columns that we could then fill with its child elements. And a lot of stuff is possible here. So things like spanning elements across multiple rows and columns, overlap different elements, and more. So we use CSS Grid in two-dimensional contexts, where it allows us to write a lot less nested HTML and also easier to read CSS. And you will start appreciating these characteristics of CSS Grid once you actually start using it and maybe comparing it to things like Flexbox or even float layouts. So CSS Grid completely changes the way that we envision and build two-dimensional layouts with CSS. And therefore, we can say that, in a way, CSS Grid completely revolutionized CSS. Now, one common misconception that many beginners have is that CSS Grid is meant to replace Flexbox. However, that is really not the case. So instead, Flexbox and CSS Grid work together perfectly. You simply use them in different situations. So when you need a one-dimensional layout, then you can simply reach for Flexbox. But if you need a two-dimensional layout, which is usually a grid anyway, then you can use CSS Grid for that. So again, one does not replace the other, but instead they work together really nicely. And now we need to once again talk about some terminology here so that when I talk about CSS Grid, we are all on the same page here. So as we just learned already, actually, the grid container is basically where everything happens. And we create a grid container by setting its display property to grid. Then all the child elements of the grid container will be the grid items. So again, just like we learned before, and also this is quite similar to Flexbox, right? Then also like Flexbox, we also have axes here. So we have a row axis and a column axis. Now, unlike Flexbox, we cannot change the direction of the row and the column axis, which in my opinion actually makes it even a bit easier to work with CSS Grid. All right. So this is the basic terminology about CSS Grid. However, since two-dimensional layouts are a bit more complex, we need actually some more terminology in order to really understand what's going on. So let's look at some more terminology here. So this is what we just saw before, but now let's also introduce the concept of grid lines, which are these lines which basically divide up the grid and separate the columns and the rows. And as you can see, these grid lines are numbered from 1 to the number of columns plus 1 and the number of rows plus 1. So if we have 3 columns, then we have 4 grid lines for the columns. And if we have 2 rows, then we have 3 grid lines for the rows. And these numbers are actually important because we can use them to place a grid item exactly in one place in the grid where we want it to be. Now, the intersection of all these grid lines, so both the grid lines for the columns and the rows, then creates all these areas into which we can place our grid items. And these areas are called the grid cells. Okay, so grid cells are always created, but they don't always need to be filled. So in this case, we only have 5 grid items, but there's still 6 cells, simply because this is a grid with 3 columns and 2 rows. And so 3 times 2 makes 6. So again, each of these spaces is called a grid cell, but they don't always need to be filled by a grid item, and also they don't need to be filled entirely. Next up, as we saw in the last lecture, we can actually create spaces between the grid items, and these are then called gutters or gaps. So remember, for that we use the gap property or also the row gap and column gap property. So technically, these are actually called gutters. Okay? Finally, another term that is commonly used when we talk about CSS Grid is the term of grid track. So a grid track can be a row or also a column. So each of these are grid tracks. And so in this example here, we have 2 row tracks and 3 column tracks. Okay? And we call these tracks because these concepts are a bit more about the space itself and not about the grid items. So a little bit like a grid cell, right? So remember, a grid cell might be filled by a grid item or not, but what matters is that there is some theoretical space. And the same applies to the grid track. Okay, but now I promise that's it about terminology. And I know that this is a lot to take in, so please don't worry too much about all these terms at this point. So with time, this will come naturally to you, especially things like grid cell, the grid lines, and the gutters or gaps. So these are important terms that we're going to use all the time, and so at some point you will naturally know about these. And now to finish, just like in the Flexbox lecture, let's now take a look at an overview of some of the properties that we can use on the grid container and on the grid item. And starting with the properties for the grid container, the most important ones are the grid template rows, grid template columns, the column gap and row gap, which together make up the gap property, and then also justify items and align items, which we can use to align the items inside rows or inside columns. So in other words, horizontally and vertically. So just like before, I have the default value for each of the properties and a short description. So I think it would be very helpful for you if you could print out this overview kind of as a cheat sheet so you can have it handy whenever you start writing your own CSS Grid code. So I will not go over all of these here now one by one, because of course we will do that in practice. But anyway, there are also 2 less important properties on the grid container, which are justify content and align content. So these only apply if the container is actually larger than the grid. And so these are usually not that important. And by the way, actually this overview of the CSS Grid properties does not contain all of them. So there is actually a huge amount of CSS Grid properties, but we will not talk about all of them here in this course, because that would just be too confusing for beginners. This course should be comfortable for you as a CSS beginner, and therefore we are not going to overcomplicate things too much. All right. So anyway, now about the grid items, there is the grid column and the grid row properties, which are very important to place grid items into a specific cell. Then finally, we have justify self and align self, which hopefully you can recognize from Flexbox. So align self is used to override align items, and justify self is used to override justify items for one individual grid cell. So again, just like in Flexbox. So this is an overview of the most important CSS Grid properties that we're going to use in this course. So make sure to print this out and have it next to your keyboard once we start writing code in the next lecture.